Well, hello. Welcome back to part two of the Intro to Cultural Anthropology podcast. We're continuing talking about ethnicity and nationalism. So let's talk about ethnicity and conflict. Sort of picking up where we left off before, um, we understand that culture is oftentimes a conflict with itself, right? Especially when you have such a sort of like diverse cultural background, right? If we look at the United States, we have a lot of different cultures that have come together into the same place, and those cultures are changing, right? And so we see conflict take place. We see different ideologies butt heads against each other. And this can be due to different power structures and how they change. Changes in leadership, right, can have a big impact on those communities. If we think about sort of the biggest issues that we're facing sort of today, considering things like our politics, whether or not you're a conservative or liberal or Republican or Democrat, oftentimes we're seeing sort of the extremes. And the extremes of these are the ones that sort of make the most noise but represent the least amount of people. Because again, there's sort of the extreme on the outside, um, and they're usually looking in, wanting to create that social change. Um, so in our case, because our culture is changing so drastically in so many different ways, and there's many different viewpoints, that conflict is pretty intense, right? We start seeing all kinds of issues. So how does that impact our sense of identity? Right? So if we have this overarching belief that we are Americans, but at the same time we've got sort of conflicting ideas about what being an American actually looks like. You know, are you connecting your race to being a part of America? Are you connecting your religion to being a part of an American identity? Excuse me. These are different things that can have a big impact on that, and that's where a lot of that conflict can come into play. Because as we've been seeing, there has been this big shift. Going back to the religious lecture, um, when we look at sort of the demographics of how religion is changing and being experienced by Americans, we've seen this sharp drop in the last few decades uh, of people who claim to be Christian and then are no longer claiming to be Christian, either because they have changed religions or they don't want to be a part of the sort of the religious structure, right? The actual like mechanisms of religion, instead rather sort of conducting their own spiritual practice, their own faith in their own way. Or there is a growing component of atheists and agnostics um, that more and more families are sort of becoming without having that religious connection. That can be a big issue, right? Because the identity that you might have when it is challenged by someone else, specifically dealing with some of these major issues, especially if we're talking about religion, those self identifiers become something that is very, very important. And if it comes into conflict, that's when we start seeing those big issues, right? And we see that within our politics. Um, and it's been going on for decades. The idea of is this a Christian nation? Is this uh, a place where you can have religious diversity? right? A lot of times when we talk about sort of the separation of church and state, it wasn't necessarily designed for the fact that anyone could practice here. It was more about making sure that, a place like the Vatican wouldn't have control over the state, wouldn't have control over the country. And this was evident with John F. Kennedy. One of the biggest issues that Americans had in voting JFK into office was the fact that he was Catholic. And because he was Catholic, they were worried that the Pope would have a lot of control or sway over American politics. So it wasn't necessarily designed to facilitate religious freedom, although that has definitely been a part of it. But a lot of it came from concern that religious entities would have more sway over um, the federal and possibly state governments. So, we've had this long tradition of having a Judeo-Christian lineage, historical identity, and that has been changing drastically over the years. Um, and so we're seeing that sort of conflict take place in modern politics. Um, so when we're looking at different cultures, when we're looking at their relationships amongst themselves, a lot of rural communities usually don't have those sort of major conflicts, and if they do, they usually fracture off and create their own cultural identity. Um, or, like in our case, we just have a ton of conflict, and that's what we're trying to deal with now in this country is how do we deal with the power that is shifting away from certain ideologies. um, and that's a really interesting thing to sort of consider, especially in politics. If you were to look at the federal government, you have a lot of like boomer generation folks that are currently in positions of power. Um, and that's oftentimes at conflict with younger generations who have different ideas about how things should go. This is not an uncommon place to be. It isn't until when we think about generational change, and most change takes a generation to get done. We've seen in the past where ideas of like segregation, if we go back to the 1940s and World War II, we still had segregated um, battalions, right? We had in the military, there was a separate battalion for African Americans. And uh, in war, one of the things that happens is that uh, people die, people get hurt, they intermix, they have to share the same resources. And what ended up happening is that a lot of these ideas at the time within those troops was like, this is ridiculous, right? We're all fighting for each other. And so when they came back from the war, some of the men that experienced that, they ended up in the next 20 years as they got into their 40s and beyond, all of a sudden actually had access to power, and they started making those cultural changes, and it allowed communities to start looking at segregation as being bad. They didn't have the power at the time to make those changes, but as they got older, as the next generation came into power, all of a sudden we started seeing those changes. And then the children of the 1960s, when they saw the issues that they wanted to change, it wasn't until the 1980s that they became capable of creating that change. And so on and so forth, right? Every generation has its fight, but it takes a generation to win that fight. So that sort of cultural change takes place, and especially in our country, this is sort of a big issue because there is so much cultural change going on. Let's take a look at something a little bit different, right? Ethnicity as a form of opportunity. So we're really only going to sort of focus on a couple of things. One of the things is, say, like ethnic food, right? Now, it's hard to imagine, especially if you have lived along the Front Range, not having ethnic food a part of your personal experience, right? Whether or not it's Mexican, which is obviously one of the greatest foods ever created, especially when we're talking about authentic tacos, right? Tacos, oh my God, they're the best. Um, or Ethiopian food, or all of these things. We end up learning about different cultures and different experiences through their food, right? Through their home life, their cooking, the flavors that they enjoy, and then when it gets turned into a business opportunity, right? They come in, they create a restaurant, and it exposes other people to a different culinary style, right? So uh, and that becomes an avenue of opportunity. There's also something that goes along with that, right? So here's a question that I'll ask you: do you consider Taco Bell to be Mexican food? And there's going to be a number of you that are going to say no, right? Because it's fast food. In fact, it's been designed so that it will accommodate the most amount of people, right? It's been homogenized. If you go into a really authentic Mexican restaurant and then you go to Taco Bell, you're gonna see big differences. What ends up happening is that certain restaurants will not only come into play, they'll create this atmosphere, this authenticity, but over time you can see a change in it. I remember one year with my sister, we decided on Cinco de Mayo to go get Mexican. And so we go to this little Mexican restaurant in Arvada. And when I walked in the door, I immediately saw that the entire room was filled with old white people. Okay, the entire room. There's no one else, just old white people. And I instantly knew that this place would have no spice. There was no spice in any of the dishes that we were going to be having because of all of these old white people. And that was the case. When we got our meal, it showed up, and guess what? It was flavorful, but certainly not spicy. Um, what ends up happening is that you sort of adapt. If you're going to run a restaurant, you adapt to your clientele, right? Arvada itself, as a city, as a place, is pretty white bread. So anyone that's going to cater there, they might have some really authentic dishes, but the dishes that people are going to generally consume are going to match more of their traditional foods, right? If it's going to be tastier, if it's not as bland. And to to be completely honest with you, I totally enjoyed my meal there, because I'm the same way. I am not a spicy person, right? I just like um, uh, burritos and tacos where it's meat, tortilla, cheese, and lettuce, and then I'm happy. So yeah, that becomes sort of an issue, right? Where you've got authentic food, but at the same time, that food adapts to the larger population in general. Then we have places like Epcot Center, right, in Disney World, where you've got sort of this amusement park um, sort of expression of culture, where people will wear certain types of clothing and serve different types of food, which is localized. But in essence, this is about tourism, right? We're talking about not necessarily experiencing another ethnicity, another culture, but sort of just getting a dash of flavor, right, for that community, and seeing just bits and pieces of it. And that sort of brings us to our next topic of like ethnotourism. Ethnotourism um, has become a very big thing for Westerners, right? We in the last couple of decades, as travel has become much more obtainable, right? If I want to go to Mexico City right now, I could book a plane ticket to Mexico City for round trip somewhere right around $350, right? That's nothing. That's minor. A couple of years ago, they had a deal where for like $200 you could go to Reykjavik in Iceland, and it was like $200 for a round trip ticket. Uh, it's become a lot easier to travel, but here's the thing, right? We have resources, right? We have money, we have jobs, we can get that cheap flight someplace, and we have become this country that really likes to travel and explore. And so traveling to different countries can give us these different experiences. And this is also sort of a generational shift as well. If we go back to a couple of generations, the boomers, um, they didn't have the access to resources that we have now back in that time. And they also didn't have access to transportation like we have. So they focused on gaining wealth through staying local and finding a good job and developing a household and doing stuff like that. Gen X, and to a larger extent, millennials and now Gen Z are looking at sort of ideas of wealth being a little bit different. Instead of having a big house, which is super expensive to own these days, they would rather go out and have experiences, go travel someplace, go to a different continent, right? And really get to explore and build memories rather than um, sort of that traditional idea of building resources. So we now see this sort of big like ethno and eco tourism as people are traveling around to different places and experiencing those locations, and that's having a big impact on a lot of what's happening around the world. So let's say that um, Mombasa. I'll give you an example. When I was in Kenya, okay, I spent some time in Mombasa, which is about the same size as Denver. Okay. Now in Mombasa, I could walk around, and in just about any store, I could find sort of Americanized knickknacks or even just American products. I could find um, uh, uh, trinkets and things that I wanted um, to bring back as a tourist. Now, considering some of this, one of the things that happens when you start having sort of an ethno-tourism um, base in your country is you start tailoring the experiences that foreigners are going to have, right? If they know that, you are going to crave some sort of comfort food, right? You're traveling around, you're experiencing all this stuff, but biologically speaking, sometimes if we go to a new country and we're eating something new, it doesn't always sit well with you, right? So if you want to be able to get like a pizza or a burger, right? You have restaurants that will start catering to American cuisine, right? Because they know Americans are going to be coming here, right? So they're going to start changing their own um, business practices. They might start looking at creating artwork that is specifically targeted towards tourism, right? Building shops that are designed for the tourist to come in and buy their wares. And if they know that, Americans, we love elephants. We like giraffes too, but we really like elephants. Well, this community might just focus a little bit more on developing the artwork and stuff around elephants than on giraffes, right? So they're catering to a different consumer, and that can have a big impact, right? Because a lot of Americans would love to experience the traditional practice of some other culture, and this is kind of a big deal going on in like Hawaii right now, right? Especially after the fires. Uh, you've got tourism, which is a major economic impact in Hawaii. You get a lot of people going there for tourism, and they want to see the authentic Hawaiian lifestyle and dance and song and all of that stuff. And so you have people that learn that specifically for that tourist, right? For that tourist coming in, and not necessarily for maintaining it in their own culture. If they need to modify it or adapt it to have that economic um, uh, uh, sort of impact, a greater impact in your life, because you're going to get more money if you tweak it just a little bit. So you start seeing changes in culture being done through ethnotourism. This can be sort of a big deal, right? And you don't think about the fact that you might be having an impact, but just by being there, right, is going to create an influence. And then we can talk about, some other ethnic things that we buy or have that is commonplace in our own homes. What are things that you might see imported or created specifically to fulfill the needs of that consumer, right? So we oftentimes focus on artwork, specifically, let's say the Southwest, right? We have a distinct style of Southwestern artwork, which is usually coming from like Native American. So the Navajo Nation, the Dene, have this big um, uh, sort of artistic history. And so you might find pottery, you might find jewelry, right? Silversmithing and turquoise. Um, and it becomes this consumer part of their identity, right? Because they know that they can find lots of people to buy this, to have that sort of materialistic connection to that culture, to that Southwest culture. Um, but it's done through this particular style of artwork, right? So when we think about um, how we consume things here, right? Even music, right? With um, globalization, we're able to experience music from around the world, and it's becoming more and more influential. One of the things that really kind of blew my mind, and I really started to enjoy, is the Who, right? Not the old 1960s and 70s band, the Who, but the Who from Mongolia, right? And this band took like heavy metal, right, and then turned it into this amalgamation of traditional Mongolian throat singing and like hard rock. And all of a sudden, you've got this really cool, appealing music to American consumers, but also this extra added flavor for being Mongolian, right? And having this different ethnic background, but it also works with, American music style. So you can hear them on like KBPI or and I'm sure I've heard them in other places, but that's where I heard them first. Um, so we can see that the influence of American culture has not only gone around the world and influenced different places, but now it's also bringing new ideas, new music, new art for us to consume here. Um, and it has a big impact on those communities, right? Are you going to have uh, big issues with that community losing their cultural identity because they are adapting to different types of cultural pressures? Okay, so ethno and ecotourism has become a big industry. What would be the benefits and problems associated with ethnotourism? Obviously, we're not going to break into groups and discuss. So take a moment, think about this, write down some ideas, and then we'll pause for a moment and then have a discussion. Well, I'll just talk about it. Okay, pause. Okay. So we've sort of been talking about some of the benefits and the problems associated with ethnotourism. One of the issues is definitely sort of cultural change, right? If we are having an influence economically in a community, that can cause that culture to adapt to a new income resource, right? So if you've got people coming in from the United States, let's say you live in Costa Rica, and you've got Americans coming down, and this is kind of a big issue because in Costa Rica, you can go anywhere and pretty much speak English, not having to worry about having to learn Spanish. You could live there and only speak English, right? That's kind of a huge deal, right? The same can be said for Kenya for the most part. Everybody pretty much knows English there. So let's go back to Costa Rica. So let's say you go to Costa Rica and you're there for some ecotourism, right? You want to see the jungles, you want to see the howler monkeys, you want to experience that life. Um, and so all of a sudden, you've got the things that you might need to live. Now, the thing is the differences of what you need to live and what they might need to live might look quite different. Everything from the type of food that is available. Again, Americans, especially if they're tourists, don't usually have as large of a palate. So they would have to adapt to the food that is local. Well, not everybody wants to do that. It's the reason why you can find a McDonald's in just about every country, right? Because tourists and those countries want to experience what it's like to have a Big Mac and French fries. So, right, you can go to Costa Rica, you can get that cheeseburger, you can get that um, that Americanized food because that's what has become a custom because it becomes a big resource as these tourists are coming in. So there are cultural changes. At the same time, it also provides resource opportunities, right? Now you've got more money coming into these areas because Americans are going to spend more money, right? As they go on a trip, they're more willing to splurge. So buying this trinket might cost twice as much as it might in the States, but they're more than willing to pay for it to get that experience and to bring it home. Even though had it been bought by a local, it would have been 1/10 of the cost, right? So now we've got sort of the economic benefit of tourism. Um, and it's interesting to think about the impact that those economics can have to the point where in Costa Rica, the American dollar is accepted as a standard currency, right? You can go there and just pay with American dollars, and it's like, oh yeah, just go ahead and hand that to me, and you don't have to do an exchange. So that's kind of a really important thing to consider, is that economic impact. Um, and then it also kind of goes back to, again, some of the cultural impacts as well. Say you have someone that does traditional dancing or is doing a traditional experience there, and they basically show up to work dressed as they normally would, get into their regalia, and then go out and do a traditional dance. And when that dance is over, the tourists move off, and then that local would put on their blue jeans and their tennis shoes and t-shirt, and then go home and do the other things that they would normally do. Um, and sort of there can be this facade that is in place when dealing with ecotourism. What are the expectations of the tourist versus the economic benefit and difficulties that that native population is going to have to experience to um, to facilitate those tourists. Uh, so yeah, those are some of the benefits and problems that can be associated with it. The other thing is the environment, right? If you've traveled 1,000 miles to go visit a a community or another part of the country or another country itself, you're creating a carbon footprint. If you're going out and doing tours, right, that is creating an economic impact. So you can have environmental impacts. If you've got one of those places, and just thinking about like Yellowstone or Yosemite, going to those places, they are gorgeous, wonderful, amazingly majestic places. And I've been going to Yellowstone since I was a little kid. Um, but if you go there today, it is oftentimes gridlock, right? There are so many visitors that go to that area every year because they know how wonderful it is. But now you're having kind of a big impact environmentally because you've got so many people, so many cars, so much use, so much garbage, um, so many people going out hiking. It has a direct impact not only on the environment but on the species that are living there. What kind of stresses are being placed upon those environments? So, the impact isn't just cultural and material, but is also ecological, and can have um, more often than not a negative impact on the environment around there. Okay, we're gonna stop there, and then we will get back to this in a few minutes and continue on. We'll see you in a few.